Hello everyone and welcome back. Jean Umberto here. This is the last video on the timekeeper challenge or task that we have at hand. What we are going to do now is write the JavaScript code, which is of course the engine of our timekeeper. So let us go back to NetBeans and start writing the solution. So here we are back in NetBeans, and you will probably remember that in the last lecture we created two different files. The first was the timer.html, which is of course where we created our GUI or graphical user interface code, and I'm just going to go ahead and run this file for now. And you'll remember that this is the message that we got. That's a pop-up message which simply says, hey there, welcome to JS Timer. So if I click OK right here, and this is the graphical user interface, we have actually three labels: one hours, the other one minute, and the last seconds. And you can see that we have the value 0 for the hour, 0 for the minute, and 0 for the second. So the pop-up, which is of course coming from the timer.js, that's an alert which is here. So what we're going to do is get rid of this alert statement here, and I'll go ahead and save this file back to Chrome. If I refresh this page, now we don't see any alert, and that's okay. So the next step is really creating functions. So we want to create three functions. One function is going to handle the seconds, so it's going to be the engine for the second, and the other function is going to handle the minute, and the last function is of course going to generate the hour. I want you to think about how a watch operates. So we have seconds, that's where we start, and the minute will depend very much on the seconds, while the hours will depend very much on the minutes. So what we're going to do is start by creating a function for the seconds. So I'll go back here, and right after this function here, this is where we are going to write our initialization code. So I'll get out of that scope. I'm going to write another function, and I'm simply going to write a comment here, and I'm going to say the seconds. So this is going to be responsible for generating the second in our widget, and I will simply say function start second, and I'm not going to define any parameter for this function. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a variable which is going to point to the span where we are storing the second, and this is the span here with the ID sec here, right here. So you can see it's a span object, and it has the ID sec. So I'm going to point right to this span here. So I'll go back to timer.js, and I'll simply say var sec. You can call it anything like seconds or really anything that you want, but I'm just going to call it sec. Var sec equals to document dot get element by ID, and the ID is of course sec. Alright, so this is how we create a reference to an item or an object which is in the graphical user interface. So now if we want to change this value here, alright, we can simply say sec dot inner HTML, and I can actually say hey. Right, so this will basically go ahead and change the value which is right here. And if I run this file now, you won't see anything, of course. There is nothing that you're going to see because we haven't indicated that when Windows is ready we need to start running that particular function. So let us go ahead and do just that. So back in timer.js, I want to come right here in this event, and I'm going to say start second. So I'm going to call this function when the document is ready. So I'll go ahead and save this file, go back to my browser, refresh, and now you can see that instead of 0 we have that message hey. So that looks okay. The next thing we are going to do is to set an interval, and of course if you remember the video where I spoke about Windows timers, I spoke about two different functions that we can use, and that is the set interval function and the set timeout function. And in this particular scenario we are going to use the set interval function. So I'm just going to go ahead and reset this back to 0. Okay, run this file again, and basically we have 0 right there. So the next thing I'm going to do is create another variable, and I'm just going to call it counter second. I'll say var counter second, and I'll simply initialize it with the value 0. So this will be my counter. Go ahead and save this again. And now it's time to set the interval. And remember, in the video that I spoke about Windows timers, I spoke about two different functions that we can use. That is the set interval function and the set timeout function. And in this particular scenario, we need to use the set interval function. So what I will simply say is window.set interval, and I'm just going to pass it the first parameter, which is a callback or an anonymous function, and I want to call this function every after 1 second. That's of course 1000 milliseconds. I'll go ahead and separate the code right here, and right within this function, whatever that we write here is going to happen or update. In other words, change whatever value that is found right here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is basically say I want to change whatever we have here and add 1 to it. And what we want to do is to simply set the value of this object, which is of course the span object here. So we want to set this value, and of course we want it to be whatever value is stored in this variable here, that is the countersec variable. So how do we do that? We're simply going to say that sec.inner.html is equal to countersec. And if we run this code now, you won't see any changes, but you have to understand that every 1 second this value is updated to 0, but because 0 is 0, you won't be able to see what is happening here. And that is of course until we come right down here and then we increment here. I'm sure you'll remember the unary operator, that is the increment operator, and what we are doing is saying every after 1 second set the value of this object, that is the value of this HTML object here, to be whatever value is stored in this variable here, and after doing that add 1 to whatever value was stored here. So I'll go ahead and save this file. I'm going to run this HTML document again, and now you can see that every 1 second that value has been incremented, and you can see that we have our seconds counting every after 1 second. Now the next problem that we are going to try and avoid is of course having infinity. So we don't want to have numbers that keep incrementing until the end of time. We need to stop it at some point. Now logically speaking, you'll have to wait 60 seconds for you to reset this counter here and add 1 to the minutes counter here. So I'm not going to do that because of time reasons. I want to make sure that the videos are kept shorter. So what I want to do is go back here, and I want to stop this counter when the value is 5 seconds. But of course, in the real world scenario, you'll make sure that that value is 60 seconds. So to stop the infinity or clearing this interval, we are going to track this value. So what we're going to say is when the value is greater than 5, stop this counter. So I'll just write a condition there. I'll say if countersec is greater than 5, and of course the function that is used to stop the counter is the clear interval function. Now what we're going to do is to be specific as to which interval we want to clear, and for us to successfully do that we need to store this interval inside a variable. So I'll come back here and I'll simply say var interval sec. So this is going to be the interval for my seconds, and it's going to be now a reference to everything that we have written here. And now I just want to clear that interval right here. Okay, so now we are clearing this particular interval. I'll go back, run the file again, and now you can see it's counting again, counting up to 5, it has now stopped. So that is basically what you need to do. And the next step is, of course, to increment here. Every time we have 5 here, we add 1 here. And of course, when 1 is here, we need to reset this back to 0 so that it starts counting again. Alright, so now what we are going to do is simply call another function that will be start minute. So that is what we're going to start creating now. So we'll go down here and we simply say function start minute. It's not going to accept any argument as well, so it's going to be a function without any parameters defined, and we're just going to do almost the same thing that what we did here, but this time we are going to create a variable which is going to point to this MNT or minute object here, this span object here. So we'll do the same and we'll say var min for the minute, and we'll say it's going to be a reference to the document.get element by ID, and the ID is of course this one here, so we'll just paste the ID right there. Okay, so now we've got access to that object. We can do anything we want. We can set or reset whatever value is stored in that particular object. So now the first thing we're going to do is to simply say that min.inner HTML is simply going to be min.inner HTML again, but this time we'll say +1. So what I'm trying to say here is simply that we are trying to get whatever value is stored in this object and add 1 to it. But because now we are dealing with addition, and that's of course numbers, we always want to make sure that whatever we collect from the page is first passed or cast to a valid integer or valid number. And the way we do it in JavaScript is simply use the function passInt. So now this is going to take the argument, whatever value we have here, okay, and then we're going to add 1 to it. Okay, so that's all we'll do. So we can go ahead and call this function now and see what happens. So after clearing this interval, we want to call this function start minute and see exactly what happens. So we'll go ahead and do this. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now you can see that when it reached 5, we've got 1 here, which is pretty fine. Okay, so it has seen that there is a 0 there, and it has now added 1 to it. And the next thing we want to do now is to reset. We're going to reset the seconds back to 0. So I'll go back here, and I just want to say that sec dot inner HTML equal 0. So again, we start from 0, and now let's just go ahead and test that file again. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it has restarted back to 0. But now the next trouble is that it's not recounting, and what we have to do to solve that issue, simply come back here and call the start second function again. So we call that function once again, and now this is going to add 1 here every time and reset back to 0 every time. So let us go ahead and test that again. Okay, that's the first instance running. Okay, we can see we have 1 there and it's recounting again. You can see now we have 2 here, recounting the third instance. And so we have successfully created the second and the minute portion of our widget. Okay, so the next thing to do is basically create the last function, which is going to add 1 every time we have X number of minutes here, which is logically 60, but for this exercise we'll be sticking to 5 just to save time. So I'll go back here, so I'll simply say function start hours, and it's basically going to do the same like the start minute function. So we'll create a variable here, we're going to call it HR, and this is going to point to the document that get element by ID, and now we are addressing this object here, the span object with the ID HR. Okay, so the next thing is to increment whatever value is available inside that object by 1. So we'll simply say hr.inner HTML equals to hr.inner HTML plus 1. And again, like before, we need to make sure that it is passed or converted to a valid number, and we'll use the same function, and we'll say pass int, and we want to convert whatever value we collect from that object and add 1 to it. Okay, so that's almost it about this method. However, we still need to do one thing. We need to call it somewhere. And when do we want to call it? We want to say when the value of the minute is 5, but in a real world scenario, you will say when the value of the minute is 60, add 1 to the hour. So here I'll simply say if min.inner HTML is 5, and because I simply want to execute one statement, I don't need to put any curly braces. So here I simply want to say start hours, and that's all. So let us go ahead and test this file. Okay, that is 1 minute, and the seconds have been reset back to 0. Okay, that's 2 minutes. Okay, that's 3 minutes. That's 4. And the last. Okay, so we have 5 here, and then we have 1 hour right here. So the next thing that we want to do is again to reset this minute here. So when we've got an increment here, we need to reset this back to 0 as well. So we'll go back. Right in the start hours, we can actually reset the minute from here, but because we have already created one reference inside the start minute, we can just do it right here, right within the condition. So what I want to do, because I want to execute multiple statements, I will go ahead and write this code here, just paste that code there, and now I'm just going to reset. I'm just going to simply say min.inner HTML is 0. Okay, so that's exactly the last thing to be done, and I can go back, and this is the last test. Okay, that's 1 round. That's again 2. Okay, that's 3. That's 4. Okay, and that's 5. Now you can see we have 1 hour here, and we have reset the minute as well. Okay, so that's basically what we really wanted to do. So the only thing that is left to be done here is to change the value 5 with 60, so that we wait until we have 60 minutes, so we can add an hour, and to also change the value here from 5 to 60, so that we wait until we have 60 seconds for us to add a minute. Okay, so thank you for watching. You can go back and see this in action. You can rerun this file, and you can wait to see how this works. And of course, think about scenarios where you can use this implementation. That could be for a quiz, for a game, or for anything in your application. Thank you for watching, and enjoy programming.